question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
Ka ranga ahau, Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Before I address the substance of the Health and Safety Reform Bill, I would like to acknowledge the families, in particular, of the victims of the Pike River tragedy, but in fact the families of all workers killed and injured at work, particularly in the last few years as these changes to health and safety law in New Zealand have been considered. I'd like to particularly acknowledge Deborah McMillan, Anna Osborne and Sonia Rockhouse, who are in the gallery today and who have been vocal advocates for real reform, real change. This is personal to them. It's personal to them not just because they lost loved ones in tragic events at work, but because for Anna and Sonia in particular, the government, the Prime Minister, went to them and promised real change, real reform. That was his solemn promise to them as the way the government and the nation would remember the tragic loss that befell their families. And they are here today, sir, to tell Parliament that they are dissatisfied with the way this legislation has come back from Select Committee. Sir, it is with absolute regret that the Labour Party and other opposition parties have had to withdraw our support for this bill. When it was introduced, we were enthusiastic about this legislation being a progressive and bold step forward for health and safety in New Zealand. We need it. Sure, the Pike River tragedy created the political impetus for change, but if we stepped back and looked objectively at New Zealand's appalling rate of death and injury in the workplace, with or without the Pike River disaster, it was time for change. Change was long overdue. We had to stop falling for the misguided ideology of deregulation, which was the overwhelming driver of the appalling health and safety record and was, in fact, the thing that led to the Pike River disaster. So the bill as it was introduced was based on solid international evidence. It was based on Australian law that has been in place and working well for 10 years. It was based on the recommendations of the Royal Commission into the Pike River tragedy, and it was based on the government's own independent task force on health and safety. It was good law, it was evidence-based, and it drew on international best practice that we know it has been demonstrated makes for safer workplaces. So the changes that have been made at Select Committee are based on misinformation and myth-making, which that government allowed to carry on out in the public. Certain members of the government actually encouraged the myth-making. It was pleasing when the Minister finally came to the Select Committee for the estimates hearing and admitted that many of the stories out there about this bill and about the way health and safety laws are implemented are pure myth, pure fantasy. But it was too late. By that stage, too many people in business had become fearful of what this legislation would do. And the members opposite have caved in to that blatant and rampant fear-mongering. Instead of dealing with it, instead of telling the truth, instead of working with business to make them feel more secure about what this law would do, they have weakened it to the point where there is almost no point in passing this legislation anymore. Sir, the changes that have been made are a direct response to some of the most strident attacks on this legislation that were made at the Select Committee. And those came from the handful of fringe employers who do not value health and safety and come from industries with some of the worst health and safety records. It came from the farming industry. It came from the meat work industry. It came from the fishing industry. They all came along, those industries that kill and maim their workers far more than any other industries in the country, and they told us we did not need to make these changes. And the government listened to them, not to workers, not to the mainstream employers who came and told us that this legislation was necessary, that it was based on good evidence, that they had participated in the drafting of it and were pleased to see it coming before the House. No, that's not who National listened to. National listened to the ratbags, the ones who do not care for their workers. In fact, it came through clearly in the submissions that some of them have a very, very low opinion of their workers. Some of them came along and told us that by having health and safety representatives, their workforce would actively undermine the industry that they work in and would seek to destroy the businesses that they work for. That's the people that the National Party listens to on this legislation. Sir, what gives us most concern on this side of the House are the attacks on health and safety representatives. It is clear from international evidence that worker participation in health and safety matters is one of the most important factors in reducing death and injury in the workplace. And the system that works the best is having elected health and safety representatives who are elected by their workmates, who represent their workmates, who receive training and have the knowledge to ensure that the workforce has an ongoing relationship with the employer and has an ongoing say in the health and safety of that workplace. That is what works. And that is what has been most stridently attacked by the changes put in place by the National Party MPs on the Select Committee. Sir, we've heard from the government that their exclusion of small businesses from having health and safety reps, notwithstanding the fact that small businesses have a worse record of killing and maiming their workers than large businesses. Notwithstanding that, we've heard from the government that high-risk small businesses will still have to have health and safety reps. What the minister cannot tell us is what will be a high-risk business and what will be a low-risk business. A bit like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the government is saying, trust us, we'll get this right. Well, the families of the Pike River 29 trusted the government to get this legislation right. The families of the Pike River 29 trusted the government to listen to the recommendations of the Royal Commission and implement them, and the government has failed to live up to the trust that was expected of them. So how can we expect them, how can they expect us to trust them to get this right? Will farming be considered a high-risk business? Agriculture kills and maims more workers than any other industry in this country. It kills as many people as died in the Pike River disaster year after year after year. It is our most dangerous industry, and yet the minister could not tell us today in question time whether or not farming will be considered a high-risk industry. Well, if that's not going to be considered a high-risk industry, how can we trust him to say that any of the other high-risk industries, forestry, fishing, meat working, how can we trust this government to actually get that regulation right and ensure that people working in high-risk industries have the protections and the support they need to improve that appalling record of deaths and injuries that we have in our workplaces, sir? Sir, it's not just the exclusion of small businesses. The fact that employers can now structure their workplace to limit the influence of health and safety reps is another reason we are opposing this legislation. Sir, what is most insidious is a last-minute change introduced by the National MPs to allow an employer to refer a health and safety representative to WorkSafe and ask WorkSafe to remove that health and safety representative. That might not sound so bad on the surface of it, but if WorkSafe actually says, no, actually we think that health and safety representative is doing their job just fine, then the employer can then take that decision to the district court. And we know what some of our worst employers are going to do. The ones that really hate workers having a say in their workplace. The ones that came to Select Committee and told us they hate workers having a say in their workplace. They will refer those health and safety representatives to WorkSafe. And when WorkSafe says no,
I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but his time has expired.
To the
Please take your seat.